Been discussing South Africa's electricity woes, but it's certainly not the only African country with major power issues. Today, some 25 countries in sub-Saharan Africa are facing a crisis evidenced by rolling blackouts. Fungai Tarira, Africa Fund Manager over at RMB Asset Management, says that the biggest problem with investing in power generation in Africa is debt. That is, repaying loans for big projects. I spoke to him earlier, and here's what he had to say.
I think first and foremost, the fact that the World Bank has actually stepped up and advanced this loan bodes well. It means official development assistance is likely to continue coming through for the continent. It's now up to the countries to actually step up and meet the requirements that the various funding organizations have. And of course, as you rightly point out, one of the key requirements is how well they can actually pay back those funding programs that are actually put forward. It's also very important for a lot of the countries to think about the credit ratings at which they can actually access this money, because that determines how expensive or cheap that funding actually will be. But a number of funding sources have to be tapped. I mean, just looking at the size of the problem, the OECD estimates that over the next 20 years, the continent will have to spend at least 25 billion each and every year, $25 billion, to just try and get power to at least half the households that are actually on the continent. And I don't think that kind of funding can come from ODA type systems alone. Countries are going to have to tap into the bond markets and also look at developing IPPs, because that's another proven method of actually raising finance for these type of projects.
Well, if we look at a country that stands out as a case in point in that regard, it has to be Kenya. We've recently seen KenGen go into the bond market to raise capital as well. What's Kenya getting right that some of the other African countries possibly need to start paying attention to?
All private participants in, well, not only utilities, but I think in any business venture are ultimately out or in it to actually get a profit. And one of the things, or some of the things governments can actually get right, which Kenya has done right, is allowing for a pricing environment that can deliver a profit to the people who are funding the project, and also to have a regulatory environment that supports the collection. So it's one thing to actually generate this power and distribute it to the various users across the country. It's another thing to actually collect the money from those users. And if the regulatory environment that is in place supports those sort of initiatives, then that actually works well.
Well, that bond initiative with KenGen has certainly been a success. It managed to raise 25 billion Kenyan shillings in that corporate bond issue, and many considering another note to be issued next year as well. On the flip side, we've got a country like Nigeria. I mean, especially as Africa's most populous nation, this has got to be a country that has to be paying attention to power generation. I mean, what does it need to be doing? Because just as a start, we're seeing Acting President Goodluck Jonathan assuming the power sector under his portfolio already, and has made that a priority. But the question is that enough?
I think one of the key issues that has been plaguing Nigeria, unlike the rest of the continent, is not that they don't have the money. The money actually is there. It's the implementation of the various policies to actually get power generation improved, as well as distribution. We have seen, I think, a new resolute force in the form of the acting president, and I think if he can carry forward with that momentum into the power initiatives that have already been planned, but also what they're commissioning from now going forward, I think that can only be a positive thing for the country.
So we've explored the angle of development agencies funding power generation capacity on the continent, also what some of the countries themselves could possibly be doing in this regard. Let's take a look at other external finance options here. I mean, we've got Chinese, Indian and Arab sources, capital flows extensively flowing into the continent. They're making these investments. Are you foreseeing a stage where some of these players are going to be investing and funding more power generation capacity moving forward?
I think to date we've seen that capital from the East perhaps flows a little easier than other sources that Africa has tried to tap in recent times. It always boils down to the conditions of what governments, what countries have to fulfill in order to attract this sort of capital. And I think it's up to the individual governments in the different instances to make sure that they actually understand what they're actually getting themselves into. But I think the need is obvious. The continent needs the cash to actually put in the capacity for the generation, and someone somewhere around the world actually has excess cash and is willing to commit that money to the project.